I thought I had the kind of life people write cheesy love songs about. My wife, Emily, was the woman every guy envied me for, beautiful, ambitious, and full of energy. She could light up any room she walked into, and the best part was she was mine. At least I thought she was. We lived in the kind of suburban neighborhood where everything looks like it belongs in a calendar. Neatly trimmed hedges, kids riding their bikes on quiet streets, neighbors waving as they walked their dogs. We had it all. A cozy home, 2 beautiful kids, and a marriage I thought was as solid as they come. Emily had turned our life into her career. She ran a lifestyle blog and Instagram page that made people think we were the perfect family. Family goals, her followers called us. I didn't mind being in the background of her world, holding the camera while she posed with the kids in matching outfits or styled the kitchen to look like it belonged in a magazine. It made her happy, and that made me happy. I wasn't the kind of guy who craved the spotlight anyway. I was the steady one, the quiet partner holding it all together while Emily shined. I thought we were a team. I thought I could trust her. But life has a cruel way of reminding you that appearances can lie. It started on an ordinary Thursday night. Emily had been out all day for what she called a collab shoot. She was working with a local boutique to feature their new line, and she texted me that she'd grab dinner on her way home. It wasn't unusual. She often worked late when she was creating content. I'd just gotten the kids to bed and was settling into the office to finish some work. Emily's laptop was sitting on the shared desk, its screen still glowing. I wasn't snooping. I swear I wasn't. I just noticed the notification pop up. Steve, can't wait to see you tonight. Mark thinks you're working late, right? The name didn't ring any alarm bells at first. Emily had mentioned him before, said he was a colleague at her marketing job. Steve said I had the best ideas in the meeting, or Steve grabbed lunch for the team today. He's so nice. But seeing his name attached to that text made my stomach turn. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was an inside joke. Maybe I was overreacting. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I could stop myself, I clicked on the message. And just like that, my whole world flipped upside down. The chat history wasn't innocent. Not by a long shot. It was full of messages I'd never want to see my wife exchanging with another man. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. You're the best part of my day. Mark doesn't suspect a thing, right? It wasn't just the words that hit me, it was the way she talked to him. Playful. Intimate. Familiar. The way she used to talk to me. I scrolled further, each message cutting deeper than the last. There were photos too. Pictures of them at coffee shops, her smiling in that carefree way I thought was reserved for me. It was like watching someone slowly dismantle my life, one text at a time. I didn't realize I was shaking until I heard a small voice behind me. Daddy? It was Ellie, our 6-year-old. She'd crept into the office, rubbing her eyes and holding her stuffed rabbit. I slammed the laptop shut so fast it nearly fell off the desk. Hey, sweetie, I said, forcing my voice to sound calm. What are you doing up? I had a bad dream, she mumbled. I scooped her up in my arms, holding her close. Her warm little body against mine felt grounding, like an anchor keeping me from falling apart. Let's get you back to bed, okay? I said, carrying her upstairs. I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and stayed with her until her breathing evened out. I envied her in that moment. Her world was still simple. Safe. When Emily got home that night, I couldn't even look at her. She came in like nothing had happened, kicking off her heels and dropping her purse on the counter. Long day, she said, her voice light and casual. Yeah, I replied, not looking up from the TV I wasn't really watching. She leaned down to kiss my cheek, but I stiffened, turning slightly so her lips barely brushed my skin. I'm gonna head to bed, she said, glancing at her phone as she walked away. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring blankly at the screen. I didn't know what to do. My hands clenched into fists, and for a split second, I thought about storming upstairs and confronting her. But what would that accomplish? I didn't want to fight. I wanted the truth. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything except the weight of what I'd seen. Every time Emily laughed, every time she smiled, it felt like a slap in the face. I kept wondering how long it had been going on. Did she ever feel guilty? Did she even care? She didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. If anything, she was in an unusually good mood. That's when she told me about the party. We should celebrate the blog's anniversary, she said one night over dinner. 5 years. Can you believe it? I was thinking a little party, just close friends and family. A way to show everyone how far we've come. Sounds great, I said, forcing a smile. You could make one of your videos, she added, her eyes lighting up. Something sweet about our journey together. People love those. I nodded. Yeah, I can do that. She leaned over and kissed me, her eyes sparkling. You're the best. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That night, after Emily and the kids were asleep, I sat down at my computer and started working on the video. It started the way she'd expect, a montage of our life together. Photos from our wedding, clips of the kids' first steps, snapshots from vacations. I set it all to her favorite song, the one she always said reminded her of us. But halfway through, I added something she wouldn't expect. Not everything is as perfect as it seems. The tone shifted. Screenshots of her messages with Steve appeared on the screen, blurry at first, then sharpening with each frame. Can't wait to see you tonight. Mark won't suspect a thing. The final slide was a photo of her and Steve at a cafe, her hand on his arm. The truth always comes out. I watched the video over and over, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Emily wanted to show the world her perfect life? Fine. I'd show them the truth. The night of the party felt surreal. Emily was radiant, gliding around the house in an emerald green dress that hugged her figure perfectly. She looked every bit the influencer her followers adored, poised, charming, and completely in control. Watching her laugh with friends and pose for photos made my stomach churn. She was so convincing, so good at playing the part of the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the successful career woman. But I knew the truth now. And soon everyone else would too. The house was packed. Close friends, family, her business contacts, and a few local sponsors she was trying to impress. It was everything Emily had dreamed of. The dining room table was piled high with catered appetizers, and a photographer she'd hired was busy capturing the evening's authentic moments. Every smile, every laugh was staged like a scene from a movie. Emily flitted from group to group, her laugh ringing out like a bell. "Isn't this wonderful?" she said to me at one point, slipping her arm through mine as we stood near the kitchen. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Anything for you," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. She kissed me on the cheek and moved on, leaving me standing there alone. I took a deep breath and glanced at my watch. It was almost time. The living room had been transformed into a small presentation space. Emily had set up a projector and screen for a slideshow about her blog's journey. Huge thank you to everyone who had supported her along the way. I had offered to make a video for it, claiming it was a surprise, and she had been thrilled. "This is going to blow everyone away," she'd said earlier, squeezing my hand. "You always make the best videos." Now, as she called everyone into the room, I felt my palms start to sweat. The guests shuffled in, filling the chairs we'd borrowed from neighbors and spilling onto the couches and floor. Emily stood at the front of the room, glowing under the warm light of the chandelier. "I just want to thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice smooth and confident. "This blog started as a little hobby, something to keep me busy while the kids were young. I never imagined it would grow into this incredible community. You've all been such an important part of that journey, and I'm so grateful." There were murmurs of agreement and polite applause. Emily gestured toward me, her smile bright. "And, of course, none of this would have been possible without my amazing husband, Mark. He's been my biggest supporter, my rock, and the best partner I could ever ask for." The applause grew louder and all eyes turned to me. I forced a smile, nodding at the crowd. "And now," Emily continued, "Mark has prepared something special to celebrate these 5 incredible years. A little look back at where we started and how far we've come." She clicked the remote and the screen lit up. The video started exactly the way she expected. The opening chords of her favorite song played as photos of our wedding filled the screen. There we were, young and in love, smiling at each other like nothing could ever come between us. Next came clips of the kids. Ellie's first steps, Jake's first day of school, family vacations where we were all laughing in the sun. The guests oohed and awed, some even wiping away tears. Emily glanced at me from the front of the room, her eyes shining. But then the music faded and the screen went black. For a moment there was silence. Confused murmurs rippled through the room. Emily turned to me, her brow furrowing slightly. And then the text appeared, "Not everything is as perfect as it seems." The room fell completely silent. The next slide showed blurry screenshots of text messages, slowly coming into focus. At first they were hard to read, but as they sharpened, the words became impossible to ignore. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Mark doesn't suspect a thing. Our little secret makes it even hotter." Gasps echoed through the room. Emily froze, her smile vanishing as her eyes locked on the screen. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. The messages kept coming, filling the screen with damning evidence. Then came the photos, Emily and Steve sitting too close in a coffee shop, her hand on his arm, both of them smiling in a way that made my stomach churn. The final slide appeared. The truth always comes out, even in the most perfect families. The room erupted. Some people stifled shocked laughter, others murmured in disbelief. Emily's face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words. She turned to me, her eyes wide with panic. "Mark, what is this?" she demanded, her voice rising above the chaos. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching as the facade she'd worked so hard to build crumbled around her. "Is this a joke?" one of her friends asked, looking between us. Emily stumbled forward, clutching the remote like it might somehow erase what everyone had just seen. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I said, my voice calm but icy. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, please let me explain." But the guests weren't waiting for explanations. People were already gathering their things, whispering to each other as they made for the door. A few shot me sympathetic looks, while others avoided my gaze altogether. Emily's parents stood in the corner, their faces a mix of anger and humiliation. Her father shook his head and walked out without a word. Within minutes the party was over. When the last guest left, Emily turned to me, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Do this to you?" I shot back, my voice rising. "How could you do this to us? To our kids? Do you have any idea what you've destroyed?" "I made a mistake," she cried. "I was stupid, but that doesn't give you the right to humiliate me like this." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You humiliated yourself, Emily." I just held up a mirror. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. Then, without another word, she stormed upstairs, leaving me alone in the wreckage of what used to be our life. The silence after the party was deafening. Emily hadn't come back downstairs, and I hadn't gone after her. The living room still smelled like wine and hors d'oeuvres, but now it felt cold and sterile. Plates and glasses were abandoned on tables, and the decorations she'd painstakingly picked out hung limply in the quiet. I stood there for a while, staring at the mess. A part of me wanted to feel victorious, like I'd won something by exposing her lies. But mostly I just felt hollow. The kids were asleep upstairs, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded in their home. I couldn't stop thinking about them. How would this all end for them? For us? Eventually, I forced myself to start cleaning up. I grabbed a garbage bag and went from room to room, tossing out half-eaten appetizers and crumpled napkins. My hands were on autopilot, but my mind was racing. Emily didn't come down that night. I wasn't surprised. Around midnight, I crept upstairs and peeked into the kids' rooms. Ellie was curled up with her stuffed rabbit, Jake sprawled out with one leg hanging off the bed. I stood in the doorway of each room for a moment, listening to their soft breathing. Finally, I went to our bedroom. The door was closed and I didn't bother knocking. Inside, Emily was curled up on the bed, her makeup smudged and her emerald dress crumpled. She looked like she'd been crying, her face red and puffy. She didn't say anything as I grabbed a pillow and blanket from the closet. "Where are you going?" she finally whispered, her voice raw. "Guest room," I said shortly, not looking at her. "Mark, wait." I didn't wait. I closed the door behind me and headed to the guest room. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the kids downstairs. Their laughter mixed with the clatter of dishes, and for a brief moment, I let myself imagine everything was normal. Then I heard Emily's voice. She was trying to sound cheerful, but there was a shakiness to it that gave her away. I dragged myself out of bed and headed down. In the kitchen, Emily was pouring cereal into bowls while Ellie and Jake sat at the table, still in their pajamas. She glanced up when I walked in, her eyes pleading silently. "Morning, Daddy," Ellie chirped, her face lighting up. "Morning, kiddo," I said, forcing a smile. I kissed her on the top of her head and ruffled Jake's hair. "Do you want coffee?" Emily asked, her voice hesitant. "I'll get it," I replied, brushing past her to grab a mug. The tension in the room was unbearable. The kids didn't seem to notice, but Emily and I were locked in this quiet, awkward dance. Every move felt like a battle. Who would speak first, who would break first? After breakfast, the kids went outside to play, leaving Emily and me alone in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to talk," she said. "Yeah, we do," I replied, my voice cold. She looked down at the floor, taking a deep breath before meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am." I didn't say anything. "Steve was a mistake," she continued, her words coming out in a rush. "It wasn't serious, it was just stupid. I got caught up in something that I didn't know how to stop. But it didn't mean anything, Mark. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, my voice rising. You lied to me for months. You met him behind my back. You let him touch you, kiss you, who knows what else, and you want me to believe it didn't mean anything? Tears welled up in her eyes and she started to speak, but I cut her off. You had a choice, Emily. You could have come to me. You could have talked to me if something was wrong, if you weren't happy. But instead, you threw everything away for, what? Some cheap thrill? I was stupid, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't thinking. No, you were thinking, I shot back. You were thinking about yourself. About how exciting it must have felt to sneak around, to have some idiot stroke your ego. Her face crumpled and she buried her face in her hands. I turned away, unable to look at her. For the next few days we barely spoke. She stayed out of my way and I stayed out of hers. We functioned for the kids, making meals, helping with homework, pretending everything was fine. But the cracks were impossible to ignore. One night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself sitting alone in the office. The house was quiet, and the glow of the computer screen felt like the only light in the world. I opened the folder where I'd saved all the evidence, screenshots of their texts, photos, everything. My finger hovered over the delete button. Part of me wanted to erase it all, to pretend it had never happened. But I couldn't. Instead, I started drafting a letter to a divorce lawyer. Emily must have sensed what was coming because, the next morning, she cornered me in the kitchen. Mark, please, she said, her voice desperate. We can get through this. I know I screwed up, but we can fix it. For the kids. For the kids, I repeated, my voice flat. That's the only reason I'm still here. Her face fell and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I'm filing for divorce, I said bluntly. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Emily's hand flew to her mouth and she stumbled back a step, shaking her head. Mark, no, she whispered. Yes, I said firmly. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. She started crying again, pleading with me to reconsider, but I was done listening. Save your tears for someone who cares, I said coldly. This is over. And just like that, I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there with nothing but her regrets. Filing for divorce wasn't a decision I made lightly. I spent nights sitting awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was doing the right thing. I thought about the kids, Ellie's giggle when she told me about her boyfriend at school, Jake's wide-eyed look of concentration when he worked on a puzzle. They were my world and the thought of breaking it apart made me sick. But then I'd think about what Emily had done, how she'd lied to me, disrespected me, and risked everything we had built. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get past it. I couldn't see a future where I could look at her and not feel the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. The next week was brutal. The tension in the house was suffocating, like a storm that hadn't yet hit but was just on the horizon. Emily hovered around me, watching for any sign that I might soften, but I didn't. I couldn't. On Monday morning, I made the call to the lawyer. By Wednesday, I had an appointment scheduled. Emily must have noticed the change in me because she cornered me again that night after the kids were in bed. Mark, please, she said, her voice trembling. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, her eyes red and swollen from crying. We can fix this. I know we can. How? I asked bluntly, crossing my arms. How do we fix this, Emily? You think an apology and a couple of tears are going to make me forget everything you did? That I'm just going to wake up one day and trust you again? She flinched like I'd hit her, but I didn't stop. You didn't just cheat, Emily. You lied to me for months. You made me feel like a fool in my own home. How am I supposed to move past that? She stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. I'll do anything, she whispered. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. I'll quit my job. I'll delete my Instagram. Just don't do this. Don't throw us away. You already threw us away, I said coldly. I'm just cleaning up the mess. Her face crumpled and she let out a choked sob. For a moment I thought she might collapse. But instead she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, feeling hollow. The kids didn't notice the changes at first. I made sure of it. Every morning I helped them get ready for school, packed their lunches and kissed them goodbye at the door. In the evenings I played games with them, read their favorite bedtime stories and tucked them in with a smile. But Ellie was smart. Too smart. One night as I was tucking her in, she looked up at me with those big, curious eyes of hers. Daddy, she said softly, why do you sleep in the guest room now? My heart stopped. I thought it was just because you were sick, she continued, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. But you're not sick anymore. I sat down on the edge of her bed, my stomach twisting into knots. Ellie, I said carefully, sometimes mommies and daddies have problems. Grown-up problems. But I promise you, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you and Jake. That'll never change. Is Mommy mad at you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, I lied. Mommy and I are just figuring some things out. But it's going to be okay, sweetie. I promise. She nodded, her little face serious. Okay, Daddy. I kissed her forehead and stayed with her until she fell asleep. But after I left her room, I sat in the hallway for a long time, my head in my hands. Friday was my appointment with the lawyer. The office was small and unassuming, tucked away in a strip mall next to a nail salon. I sat in the waiting room, fiddling with my wedding ring. It felt heavy on my finger, like it didn't belong there anymore. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, greeted me with a firm handshake and a no-nonsense attitude. She listened quietly as I explained the situation, nodding occasionally and taking notes. I want custody of the kids, I said firmly. Emily can have visitation, but I want them with me. Lisa leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. I understand, she said. But I have to be honest with you, custody battles can get messy. If Emily wants to fight this, it could drag on for months, even years. Are you prepared for that? I nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not losing my kids. Good, she said. We'll file the papers next week. But in the meantime, I need you to document everything, any interactions you have with Emily, any behavior that might be relevant to the case. And whatever you do, don't lose your temper. Stay calm no matter what. I can do that, I said, my voice steady. But as I left her office, the reality of what I was about to do hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just ending my marriage, I was declaring war on the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world. When I got home that night, Emily was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes searching mine. Where were you? She asked, her voice wary. Out, I replied shortly, brushing past her. She didn't press me. The kids were already in bed, so I went to the guest room and shut the door. But I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the look on Emily's face when she found out I'd filed for divorce. The betrayal, the anger, the hurt. I hated her for what she'd done to me, but I couldn't deny that part of me still felt something for her. Maybe it was love, or maybe it was just the ghost of what we used to have. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. She'd made her choice. Now I was making mine. The papers were filed the following Monday. I came home to find Emily sitting at the dining table, the envelope already opened in front of her. Her hands were trembling as she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. Mark, she said, her voice breaking, you really did it? Yes, I said simply, my voice cold. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. How could you? She demanded. After everything we've been through, after everything we've built, you're just going to throw it all away? I didn't throw it away, I shot back. You did. The second you decided to cheat, you ended this marriage. I'm just making it official. Her face crumpled and she let out a choked sob. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. But it was too late for apologies. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with nothing but the wreckage of what she had destroyed. After the papers were filed, the tension in the house hit a breaking point. Emily's silence was no longer just awkward, it was suffocating. She barely spoke to me unless it was about the kids, and even then, her words were clipped and her eyes filled with resentment. I couldn't bring myself to care. I was past the point of trying to soothe her guilt. The only thing that mattered to me now was Ellie and Jake. They were the only reason I was still in this house, walking on eggshells every day to keep things from boiling over in front of them. But kids are smart. They know when something isn't right, even if they don't understand what's wrong. Ellie had started clinging to me more, asking questions I couldn't answer. Jake, who was usually full of energy, seemed quieter lately, like he was trying to figure out why the air around us felt so heavy. One night, as I was tucking Jake into bed, he looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes of his. Daddy, he asked softly, are you and Mommy mad at each other? I felt my chest tighten. Why do you ask that, buddy? He shrugged, fiddling with the edge of his blanket. You don't hug her anymore. And you don't laugh at her jokes. I sat down on the edge of his bed, running a hand through my hair. How was I supposed to explain this to a 7-year-old? Sometimes, I began, choosing my words carefully, grown-ups don't always get along. But that doesn't mean we don't love you. You and Ellie are the most important things in the world to us. Don't ever forget that, okay? He nodded, but his brow furrowed in that way it always did when he was trying to figure something out. Are you gonna be mad forever? He asked. I didn't have an answer. The next morning, Emily and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen while the kids were getting ready for school. She was standing at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. I could feel her eyes on me as I loaded the dishwasher. "Mark," she said quietly. I didn't respond. "Can we just talk? Please?" I closed the dishwasher and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "What do you want to talk about?" "Us," she said, her voice trembling. "The kids. Everything." I let out a bitter laugh. "There is no us, Emily. That's the whole point." She flinched, her hand tightening around the coffee mug. "I know I screwed up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you. But I'm begging you, don't do this to our family. Don't do this to the kids. Don't you dare bring the kids into this," I snapped, my voice low but sharp. "You think I'm doing this to them? You did this. You're the one who cheated, the one who lied. You're the reason this family is falling apart." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too tired to comfort her anymore. "I'll do anything," she said desperately. "Counseling, therapy, I'll quit my job if you want me to. Just, don't give up on us." "You gave up on us the second you let Steve into your life," I said coldly. "And you know what the worst part is? I don't even think you're sorry for what you did. You're just sorry you got caught." Her face crumpled and she let out a choked sob. "That's not true," she whispered. But it didn't matter. I was done listening to her excuses. That weekend, I packed a bag for the kids and took them to my parents' house. I told Emily it was so they could spend time with their grandparents, but the truth was, I needed space. I needed to get out of that house and clear my head. My mom didn't ask too many questions when I showed up with Ellie and Jake, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. After dinner, once the kids were asleep, she sat down with me at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. I hesitated, staring at the swirling steam rising from my own mug. "Emily and I are getting a divorce," I said finally. Her expression didn't change, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said softly. "I know how much you loved her." "Yeah," I said bitterly, running a hand through my hair. "I guess it didn't mean much to her." For a while we just sat there in silence. My mom didn't press me for details, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to talk about it yet, not with her, not with anyone. When I finally went to bed, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Being at my parents' house felt like a break from the storm, but I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Was she sitting alone in the house, crying herself to sleep? Or was she texting Steve, trying to piece together whatever scraps of validation she could get from him? I hated that I still cared. By the time I got back on Sunday, the house was eerily quiet. Emily was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "I'm filing for full custody," I said bluntly, setting the kids' bags down by the door. That got her attention. She turned to me, her face pale and her eyes wide. "What?" "You heard me," I said. "I'm not going to let you drag the kids through this mess any more than they already have been." Her hands flew to her face and she let out a shaky breath. "Mark, please. Don't do this." I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. "Why not? Give me one good reason why I shouldn't." "Because they need both of us," she said desperately. "No matter what I did, I'm still their mother. They need me. They need stability," I shot back. "They need a parent they can trust. And you've proven that isn't you." Her shoulders sagged and for a moment I thought she might crumble right there on the couch. But then she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, defiance. "If you think I'm going to let you take my kids away from me, you're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll fight you, Mark. I'll fight you with everything I have." I stared at her, my jaw tightening. "Do what you have to do," I said coldly. "But I'm not backing down." The house became a battlefield after that. Every interaction between Emily and me felt like it was loaded with unspoken accusations and thinly veiled anger. The kids were the only thing holding the fragile piece together, and even that felt like it was cracking. Emily didn't take my declaration about custody lightly. She stopped crying and pleading and started fighting. I'd come home to find her on the phone with lawyers or sitting at the dining table, poring over documents. She'd leave things lying around that I wasn't supposed to see. Notes about legal strategy, details about establishing parental fitness, whatever that meant. It was like living with a stranger. One morning, I was pouring cereal for Ellie when Emily walked into the kitchen, dressed in workout clothes like she had somewhere to be. "I want to talk," she said, her tone clipped. "Now's not a good time," I replied, glancing at Ellie, who was happily munching on her frosted flakes. "Now's the only time I have," she snapped. Ellie looked up, her spoon paused mid-air. "Are you and Mommy mad again?" I felt my chest tighten. "No, sweetie," I said quickly, forcing a smile. Mommy and I just need to talk about grown-up stuff. Emily sighed and leaned against the counter, waiting until Ellie grabbed her backpack and headed into the living room. I met with my lawyer, Emily said once we were alone. She thinks we should do mediation. I frowned. Mediation? What, to split up our stuff? To split custody, she said flatly. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. You think I'm going to agree to that? It's better than a drawn-out court battle, she said, crossing her arms. The kids don't need to go through that. And neither do we. I shook my head, my jaw clenching. I'm not splitting custody with you, Emily. You don't get to have them half the time after everything you've done. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old Emily, the one who hated to lose. I'm their mother, she said through gritted teeth. I made a mistake, Mark, but that doesn't make me a bad parent, doesn't it? I shot back. You think running off to screw your coworker makes you a role model? Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. You think you're perfect? She fired back. You've been checked out of this marriage for years, Mark. You put more effort into your work and your stupid hobbies than you ever did into us. I felt the anger rise in my chest, sharp and hot. Don't you dare try to blame me for this, I growled. You're the one who cheated, Emily. Not me. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Jake wandered into the kitchen, holding a toy truck. Daddy, can we play outside after school? He asked, his wide eyes darting between us. Of course, buddy, I said, forcing a smile and ruffling his hair. Emily pressed her lips together and stormed out of the room. I knew this was just the beginning. The custody fight wasn't going to be easy, and the thought of it made me feel like I was carrying a boulder on my back. But I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let her drag the kids into her mess. That night, I stayed up late going through every document Lisa, my lawyer, had sent me. She'd warned me to keep a record of everything, any interactions with Emily, any behavior that might be relevant to the case. I felt like a spy in my own home, taking notes on conversations and snapping photos of her texts when she wasn't looking. It felt wrong, but I told myself it was necessary. A week later, Emily came home with news that made my blood run cold. Steve's willing to testify, she said casually, dropping her bag on the counter. I froze. Testify? About what? She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. That I'm a good mom. That the affair didn't affect my parenting. I let out a bitter laugh. You've got to be kidding me. You think anyone's going to believe that guy? He's the reason we're in this mess. Her expression hardened. It doesn't matter what you think of him, Mark. What matters is what the court sees. And Steve's a respected professional. He can vouch for me. I stared at her, my hands balling into fists at my sides. You really have no shame, do you? Her eyes flashed with anger. I'm fighting for my kids, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes. Maybe you should think about doing the same. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I'd once trusted with my life was now using her affair partner as a weapon against me. It was almost laughable. That weekend, I called Lisa and told her everything. She's bringing him into this, I said, pacing the guest room with the phone pressed to my ear. She actually thinks he can help her case. Lisa was quiet for a moment. It's a risky move, she said finally. The court might see it as a sign of poor judgment. But it could also work in her favor if he comes off as credible. Credible? I scoffed. The guy's a homewrecker. How is that credible? It's not about what we know, Mark. It's about what we can prove. And right now, Emily's still legally entitled to fight for custody. If Steve can paint her as a devoted mother, it could sway the court. The thought made my stomach turn. What do I do? Stay calm, Lisa said firmly. Keep gathering evidence. And whatever you do, don't lose your temper. The last thing we need is for you to look unstable in court. Unstable? I echoed, my voice rising. Mark, she said gently, I'm on your side. But you need to keep it together. For the kids. Her words hit me like a bucket of cold water. She was right. No matter how much I hated Emily, no matter how much I wanted to rip Steve apart, I couldn't let my anger get the better of me. I had to focus. That night, as I sat alone in the guest room, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The divorce, the custody battle, the betrayal, it was all too much. But then I thought about Ellie and Jake, about their smiles and their laughter and the way they looked at me like I was their whole world. I couldn't let them down. This fight wasn't about Emily or Steve or even me. It was about them. And I was going to do whatever it took to protect them. The weeks leading up to the custody hearing were the longest of my life. I'd always thought of myself as a patient man, the kind of guy who could keep his cool under pressure. But this was something else entirely. Emily and I were like strangers living in the same house, passing each other intense silence or exchanging clipped words when necessary. The kids could feel it too, even though I tried my best to shield them from the worst of it. Ellie had stopped asking questions, but her eyes followed me everywhere, like she was trying to figure out what I wasn't telling her. Jake, on the other hand, had grown clingier, curling up next to me during movie nights or grabbing my hand when we walked to the park. It broke my heart. Meanwhile, Emily had gone full-on warrior mode. She was polite around the kids, almost overly sweet, but behind closed doors she was relentless. She spent hours on the phone with her lawyer, her voice sharp and determined. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of the woman I used to know, the one who wouldn't back down from a challenge. But now that determination was aimed at me. One night after the kids were in bed, Emily cornered me in the kitchen. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked, her voice low but shaking with barely controlled anger. I didn't look up from the dishes I was washing. "Do what?" "Take them away from me," she said, her voice cracking. "They're my kids too, Mark." I set the plate down and turned to face her, gripping the edge of the sink to keep my hands steady. "I'm not taking them away, Emily. I'm giving them a stable home. A home where they don't have to deal with your lies and your selfishness." Her face twisted in anger. "Selfish? You think I'm selfish? You've been checked out of this marriage for years, Mark. Don't act like you're some perfect husband who's never made mistakes." "I didn't cheat," I said coldly. "That's the difference." She flinched, and for a moment I thought she might back down. But then her expression hardened. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "If you want a fight, you'll get one. But don't think for a second that I'm going to let you take them without a fight." I watched her storm out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The first court date came faster than I expected. I stood outside the courthouse in a suit I hadn't worn in years, clutching a folder full of notes and evidence Lisa had helped me prepare. Emily showed up a few minutes later, wearing a conservative dress that made her look every bit the picture-perfect mother she wanted the court to see. Steve wasn't with her, thank God, but I knew he was still in the background, ready to step in if she needed him. We barely looked at each other as we walked into the building. The hearing was less dramatic than I'd imagined, at least at first. The judge listened to both sides, nodding occasionally and jotting down notes. Lisa handled most of the talking for me, calmly laying out my case, that I was the primary caregiver, that I had a stable job and a strong support system, and that I could provide a more secure environment for the kids. Emily's lawyer countered with the usual arguments, that the kids needed both parents, that Emily was still an involved and loving mother, and that splitting custody was in their best interests. It wasn't until Emily took the stand that things got heated. "Mrs. Carter," Lisa began, her voice calm and measured, "can you explain your relationship with Mr. Steve Grant?" Emily stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "He's a colleague," she said carefully. "A colleague," Lisa repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Is that all he is?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward her lawyer. "Yes," she said finally. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying you never had a romantic relationship with Mr. Grant?" There was a long pause. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "I did," Emily admitted, her voice barely audible. Lisa nodded, her expression neutral. "And when did this relationship take place?" "It's over now," Emily said quickly. "It was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake." "That's not what I asked," Lisa said, her tone sharp. "When did it take place?" Emily looked down at her hands, her face pale. "It started about 6 months ago," she muttered. Lisa turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence showing that this affair overlapped with Mrs. Carter's parenting duties, including times when she claimed to be working late or traveling for business." The judge nodded, and Lisa handed over a folder of screenshots, photos, and other documentation. I didn't look at Emily as the evidence was presented. I couldn't. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my answers short and to the point. I talked about my relationship with Ellie and Jake, about how I'd always been there for them, about the routines and traditions we'd built together. "Mr. Carter," Emily's lawyer said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you've spent long hours at work in the past, leaving your wife to handle the majority of the parenting?" I straightened in my chair, forcing myself to stay calm. "I've worked hard to provide for my family," I said evenly. "But I've never abandoned my responsibilities as a father. My kids know they can count on me, and that's what matters." The lawyer nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And isn't it also true that you created a public spectacle of your wife's mistakes by exposing her affair at a private gathering?" A murmur ran through the courtroom and the judge banged his gavel. "I didn't expose anything that wasn't already the truth," I said, my voice steady. I wanted people to see who she really is. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but the judge cut him off. Let's move on, he said, his tone firm. By the end of the day, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The hearing wasn't over yet. There were more dates to come, more evidence to present, more battles to fight. As I walked out of the courthouse, Lisa patted me on the shoulder. You did well, she said. This is going to be a long process, but I think we've got a strong case. I nodded, too drained to say much. Emily was waiting by the curb, her arms crossed and her face unreadable. For a moment we just stared at each other. Mark, she said finally, her voice soft but laced with exhaustion, what are we doing to each other? I didn't have an answer. I just walked to my car, got in and drove away. The days after the first hearing felt like a slow-motion train wreck. I'd wake up each morning with the same tight knot in my chest, wondering what kind of damage Emily and her lawyer would try next. Every move she made felt calculated, every interaction between us another reminder of how far we'd fallen. Emily, for her part, seemed to have shifted gears. She stopped trying to plead with me or sway me with apologies. Instead, she focused all her energy on the kids. She drove them to school every day, helped Ellie with her art projects, and let Jake stay up late watching movies with her on the couch. At first, I thought it was guilt, her way of making up for the mess she'd made. But then I realized it wasn't about making amends. It was about making herself look good. One Saturday afternoon, I came home from running errands to find Emily and the kids in the backyard. She'd set up a picnic blanket under the big oak tree, complete with sandwiches, juice boxes, and even a plate of cookies. Ellie was lying on her stomach, drawing on a sketch pad, while Jake was stacking blocks in some kind of elaborate fort. It should have been a sweet scene. A normal family moment. But all I could see was the careful orchestration, the performance for the inevitable courtroom arguments. Emily looked up as I walked through the back gate. Hey, she said, her tone overly casual. We were just having a little picnic. Want to join us? No thanks, I said flatly, heading inside. Her smile faltered, but she didn't press me. Later, as I sat at the kitchen table sorting through bills, Ellie wandered in holding her sketch pad. Daddy, she said, climbing into the chair next to me, can I show you something? Of course, kiddo, I said, forcing a smile. She opened the sketch pad to a drawing of our family, me, her, Jake, and Emily standing in front of our house, holding hands. She'd even drawn little hearts around us. It's beautiful, I said, my throat tightening. Do you like the hearts? She asked, her face glowing with pride. I love them, I said, wrapping an arm around her. Mommy said everything will be okay, she said matter-of-factly, looking up at me. I froze. She did? Ellie nodded. She said we'll always be a family no matter what. I swallowed hard, not knowing how to respond. I wanted to believe that was true, but the cracks in our foundation felt too deep to ignore. The second court date came quicker than I was ready for. I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, smoothing the wrinkles from my suit jacket while Lisa went over some last-minute notes. You're doing fine, Mark, she said, her tone reassuring. Just stick to the facts and don't let their lawyer bait you. I know, I said, though my hands were trembling. The courtroom was more crowded this time, probably because Emily had decided to bring in Steve. I hadn't seen him in person before, but the second he walked through the door, I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. He was exactly the type of guy I'd expected, polished, confident, and oozing the kind of arrogance that came with knowing you were the center of attention. Emily avoided my gaze as she sat down next to him. She didn't have to look at me to know what I was thinking. Steve took the stand about an hour into the hearing. He started off smooth, answering questions about his professional relationship with Emily and how they'd worked on multiple projects together. And during that time, Emily's lawyer asked, did you ever witness her neglecting her responsibilities as a mother? Never, Steve said firmly. Emily is one of the most dedicated people I've ever worked with. She always made it clear that her kids were her top priority. I clenched my fists under the table, my jaw tightening. And how would you describe her character? The lawyer continued. Steve paused, glancing at Emily before answering. She's a kind, thoughtful person who always puts others before herself. I couldn't stop myself. I let out a bitter laugh, loud enough to echo in the courtroom. Mr. Carter, the judge said sharply, fixing me with a warning look. Sorry, Your Honor, I muttered, forcing myself to stay quiet. Lisa leaned over and whispered, don't let him get to you. That's exactly what they want. When Lisa cross-examined Steve, she didn't waste any time. Mr. Grant, she began, her tone icy, you testified that Mrs. Carter's children are her top priority. Is that correct? Yes, Steve said, his confidence unwavering. And yet, you also admitted to having a romantic relationship with her while she was married. Is that correct? Steve hesitated, his smooth demeanor faltering for the first time. Yes, he said reluctantly. Lisa nodded, her expression neutral. Do you think it was appropriate to pursue a relationship with a married woman who has 2 young children? Steve shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping. It was complicated, he said finally. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Complicated. That's an interesting word. Would you say your actions contributed to the complications in Mrs. Carter's marriage? Steve glanced at Emily, who was staring down at her hands. I suppose so, he admitted. Lisa turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence showing the timeline of Mr. Grant's involvement with Mrs. Carter, including messages and photos that demonstrate how their relationship interfered with her parenting duties. The judge nodded, and Lisa handed over a folder of carefully organized documents. By the end of the day, the cracks in Emily's case were starting to show. Steve's testimony, while polished, had raised more questions than answers, and Lisa had done a masterful job of exposing the holes in his story. As we left the courtroom, Lisa turned to me with a small smile. We're making progress, she said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. When I got home that night, the kids were already in bed. Emily was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't look up as I walked in. You humiliated me today, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I dropped my keys on the counter and turned to face her. You humiliated yourself, Emily. I just pointed it out. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You really hate me, don't you? I don't hate you, I said, my voice cold. But I don't respect you anymore. And I can't trust you. That's why this marriage is over. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment I thought she might argue. But instead, she just nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I hope you're happy, Mark, she said softly. Because no one else is. I didn't respond. I just walked to the guest room and closed the door behind me.